Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. I'm going to do another a Mindgasms podcast here with Shane Kennedy, who's back here again, and he wanted to talk about this whole thing that I'm sure a lot of people have heard about, which is the Grievance studies hoax papers that Peter Boghossian and two other people I don't remember the names of. They deliberately submitted these papers to these academic journals, and they deliberately made them ridiculous as possible, like something about gender fluidity in dogs in one of them or something. And for one of them, they literally took some of Mein Kampf, Hitler's autobiography, and they replaced the words Jews with men and stuff like that. So it was
got it published
yeah,
in a scientific journal.
Yeah, exactly. It was a test to see how ideological the people who control what gets accepted and published is. So I think we're going to also show a little bit of a clip of that. I've never even tried that before, but I'm going to screen share my window where I have it playing, and we're going to play it from a certain point for about 5 minutes and then talk about that. But you wanted to give a little bit of an introduction there too, Shane, and maybe just say who you are too for people who don't know you.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Oh yes, okay. So I mean, a little bit about me. I was a Wikipedia nerd before I was a YouTube nerd, and I'm just in a part-time philosophy, history, idea junkie, and I met Andrew through the mixed mental arts community, and yeah, we've had a couple chats. I mean, I would love to talk more about myself under usual circumstances. That's one of my favorite topics, but I mean that kind of sets the stage a little bit. Beyond that, yeah. There's this parallel between. Sorry, there's this constant problem of interpretation. Whether you're interpreting postmodernism, what is it? What is Christianity? What is capitalism? What is communism? Because people try to act these ideas out in the real world, and they often differ. And then there's purists, and then we debate definitions, semantics, et cetera, et cetera. So Andrew and I've had this conversation. So when I was listening to this particular video, there's a phrase that we're looking for the lady to say. I'm sorry, I forget her name. She's going to say the words applied postmodernism at one point. And the moment I heard that, that was exactly what I was trying to say to Andrew the other day. And I figured, why not just try to have a shorter chat as we're going to shoot for, just a bit of a reaction, a little morsel for your ears and for our minds, and hopefully maybe a teaser to a conversation we'll pick up on Saturday. So with that said, yeah, let's just start the clip, and then we'll talk about it a little bit, and hopefully it's edifying, and well, it sure will be for me. So that's all that matters. So let's just leave it at that.
Okay. I'm going to try this here. All right. Okay.
That underlie how society works. Those power dynamics are trapped up in identity and mediated primarily through language and media.
Okay, so I've identified the sources of that, not only me, obviously, but I've identified the sources of that belief with the French postmodernist movement fundamentally. Other people trace some of it back farther to what's essentially something approximating a Marxist doctrine, which is a doctrine of power relations, I would say.
Sure.
Do you have any criticisms or further comments on that? Let's call it genealogy, or
Helen. Yeah, Helen.
Yeah, Helen, good.
Yeah, no, I largely agree with the idea that we had quite a profound epistemic shift in the late 60s with the rise of the postmodernists. I disagree with people who kind of relate this closely to Marxism. I think it's clear that they have a common ancestor and that they have certain ideas in common. But if we conflate Marxism and postmodernism too closely on more than those, that sort of oppressor and oppressed group, that sort of false consciousness, these sort of key ideas which really were floating around at the same time, and they've come up in the same place. if we conflate those two closely and we are not looking at the really profound differences in epistemology, in which Marxism was really trying to continue a modernist project. It was totalitarian, it was objectivist mostly, and it went sort of in a straight line. And if there is a word for the extremes of Marxism, it is totalitarianism. If there's a word for the extremes of postmodernism, it's disintegration, it's fragmentation. So we're looking now at something very different, something very intangible that is coming in, and it's saying we cannot access an objective truth. Everything is created in discourses, in powers, in systems of power and privilege.
Okay, so why in the world is power privilege then? Like, I mean, it still seems that the postmodernists are willing to assume that the pursuit of power is, first of all, obvious that everyone's pursuing it, but that it's also okay for those who don't have it to pursue it. So it's not as if they've abandoned the idea, as far as I can tell, of a linear narrative towards some end. The end seems to me to be power. And so why is that justifiable from the postmodern perspective, given that linear movement and meta-narratives aren't justifiable?
Because of the change that happened in the late 80s. So when Sokal, for example, he did his Hoax, what he was looking at was this quite sort of pure postmodernism, this very sort of intangible idea that an objective reality can't exist, that we can't grasp anything, that everything is a construct. But what happened in the 80s gradually was that this just, after prolific amounts of writing, it just kind of fizzled, because once you've disintegrated and dismantled absolutely everything and it's all in a mess on the floor, you have got nowhere to go with this. So we started seeing then the rise in materialist feminism, first of all, and then within the sort of critical race approaches, intersectionality in queer theory, in post-colonialism particularly, we started seeing a change towards, okay, so everything is a cultural construct, but we can't address anything if we don't accept that a certain group of people in a certain place at a certain time experience certain things. So what we're looking at now is an objective reality that oppression and systems of power exist, but
everything else is socially constructed. Everything else is socially constructed. So the fundamental transcendent reality is power.
But that construct has power. Yes, it is objectively true that power is benefiting straight white men and disadvantaging women of colour, trans women, etc. So this was the change that happened then. So now it's politically actionable. And this, I mean, Kimberly Crenshaw put this most explicitly when she said it's politics applied to postmodern theory.
Okay,
so we've got that shift now.
Okay, so we want to get...
We were so close.
Oh, did I stop right before that part? I'll play it a little more.
She was 30 seconds from saying applied postmodernism.
I'll play it for 30 seconds more.
Yeah, sorry about that, brother.
This straight, because it's very, very important. So you distinguish the postmodern movement from the Marxist movement, because the Marxists were still moving in a single direction, and you consider that still part of the modernist project. You equated Marxism and postmodernism insofar as they both adopt, let's say, an oppression narrative.
Yes, although many other things do too, and often that's quite warranted. I mean, the American Revolution, for example, was an oppressor-repressed revolution.
Well, there's no doubt that power and power differentials exist. The issue is whether or not there are other realities that might be considered. And
exactly. So the issue is whether that we're seeing them truly.
Yes, well, and whether it's reasonable to reduce everything to a single dimension of motivation. So the postmodern project collapses into its own nihilism, and something emerges out of the ashes, and that's the assumption that a transcendent reality does in fact exist, but that the only defining feature of that transcendent reality is the existence of power and the existence of power differential. But then identity. And that's associated with identity. Okay, but then the question becomes, there's a question that goes underneath that, which is, well, why is it that is accepted as the fundamental reality? Because there's no rationale for that postmodernism itself. In fact, postmodernists should criticize that.
No, he hasn't
They
written
do.
postmodernism.
They do very much, and this is the argument that goes on repeatedly with the old-style postmodernists saying this isn't postmodernism. And so we've tended to call it applied postmodernism.
There we go.
There you go. Okay, so here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to just set out like what if you don't mind, it's all right. Just set out the reason why I wanted to highlight that, and then let you respond. So, if I understand your position correctly, you've actually studied postmodernism as it was created, as it existed at the time that Foucault and Derrida and some of the, let's say, foundational thinkers laid out and tried to define what the project was, or what the theory was, or what the lens was, right? So when I was talking to my friend about how I was going to try to explain the point that I'm trying to make, he talked about the example of said I might want to use this Mote and Bailey theory. It's like a fallacy that some people use sometimes. So the Mote and Bailey for communism would be to always retreat back to, well, that's not real communism. Like, this is what it says it is. So any example you give is an invalid example, right? And then I said to him, well, no, I don't think that's legitimate to say to Andrew, because I think he genuinely appreciates legitimate value inside the lens. I don't think it's a intellectual sleight of hand that you're trying to play. So then he said, okay, well, fair enough. He says, well, like, take a word like feminism, right? Where whatever feminism meant when they had their first wave of feminism, it's not what it meant in the second wave. It's not what it meant today. So my point isn't to have a discussion per se about what feminism is or isn't. What I'm looking to see is your reaction to the concept that as people self-identify, as people apply these ideas, as the intellectual tradition continues forward, almost by definition, it's going to end up becoming separated from the foundational texts. Nietzsche talked about this concept where over time you just repurpose different tools and ideas to serve your own current ends. So we create the ritual or the mechanism for purpose, but then it exists in the world, and then you're going to come in and take it over. And the last example I'll give is, I don't know if you know Camille Paglia?
Camille Paglia, yeah.
Yeah, that one, yeah. So she was talking about like the hippie movement, the 60s to 70s, like the true progressives, the really free thinkers, back in the day. And when she was talking to Peterson's like, well, what happened, right? Why did these people believed in true tolerance? They didn't have a regressive bone in their body. Why do we seemingly have this narrative now that you have regressive leftists, right? And she said, well, look, all the real true ones, they went off and destroyed themselves on acid. They went out and founded communes. It was only the ones who had more of an authoritarian streak, a controlling, who liked to play the system, who stayed in academia. So what you end up getting is they end up representing that generation and those views, but they're the kind of people who want to do it in a bureaucratic, keeping my tenure, virtue signaling through academic articles kind of way. And then so the basic premise is that this applied postmodernism that they're talking about is the result of people taking this lens, mixing it with other things, and continuing to try to create articles, create value, operate at a good identity as a reputable philosopher or academic or whatever. So to put it all into a nutshell, it's like, I imagine you're still pretty reticent to see that there's such a thing as applied postmodernism, and I'll just leave it at that. So what do you think about this idea of applied postmodernism? I can't hear you. You've muted yourself.
Oh, sorry, there was background noise. I forgot I had myself muted. I wrote some notes based on what you were saying just there, and based on the section of the video that we went over there. So in terms of, like, just in general, in terms of applied postmodernism, I don't even really understand what that could mean, because like postmodernism, it's not like we've discussed before, it's not like this meta narrative that you apply to things. It's a form of analysis. Like some postmodernists like Foucault, it's like they're historians. He's not like like when people say when you inevitably put your own ideology into what you're writing and stuff. Of course you do, and like there were reasons that Foucault, for example, examined labels and categories in terms of sexuality, because he himself was a homosexual, like in the 70s, when that was a lot more culturally and legally frowned upon. But that doesn't mean that what he was doing was arguing for his particular perspective on things. It's like saying that postmodernism can be applied and turned into this ideology. To me, it's like saying that you can politicize history and sociology, and you can if you want to, but everyone understands that history and sociology, they're not like, if you just look at them themselves, people choose to politicize them, but that's not what they're all about at all. And like that's basically one of the notes that I wrote that I wrote down. Like it's a form, like postmodern writers, and what they do is analyze culture. They're not advocating for things. And like it's supposed to all be theoretical. And another thing I wrote down is the like these categories. So one of the things that these people that Jordan Peterson has a problem with, rather, like the so-called social justice warriors, they're all about advocating for creating all these new endless different gender categories and gender pronouns, which is literally explicitly the complete opposite of what Foucault writes about in the history of sexuality and some of his other writing. Like, he's explaining that a product of modernism and applying science to sexuality changed it from more of just behavior and more of something like an art form, where you would just behave in a particular sexual way, and this label wouldn't be applied to you. He was saying that once science was applied to it, that created more and more labels, and that made people less free to express themselves. So he's making the point, really, that creating more labels is not a good thing to do, which is the opposite of what these activists are doing. And I've said a lot just there, so I'll just go with my notes based on what you said there, and we can go back to the notes that I wrote down based on that actual clip there.
No worries, no worries. Okay, what I'm gonna try to wrap this up and keep it as a true teaser. And so I think the goal with it is for me to let's try to get a clear understanding of your position. And what we'll do is you can put in your notes eventually later in the future a link to where we pick up this conversation again. But we'll try to both reflect on it, because most of what you were saying was talking about what postmodernism is. And my objective is to have a conversation with you about how it actually acts in the world. And it's completely legitimate that that's not interesting to you and not where you naturally gravitate towards. So that's a fine response. But it's just, I think that part of, like for instance, when I first said I wanted to identify as Christian, okay, my friends told me, whoa, Shane, you don't want to take on that label. Do you know all the baggage that has? And I'd be like, well, dude, it's the ultimate hippie. How could it possibly be bad to identify with the ultimate hippie? Okay. And then they're like, oh no, dude, that's a bad idea. You know, like there's the sexism, there's the Catholic Church, da, 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 da. And it's like, and I said, you know what, screw it. I'll take on that baggage. And I know I'm going to get it shoved in my face all the time. I know when I say I believe in God, nobody has an idea what that means. It took me, 10 years of hardcore atheism and 5 more years of thinking to understand what that means. And it's not what I thought I was rejecting at the time, right? So I have a lot of empathy for your point of view. It's just, I'm just wondering exactly it'd be very annoying for me to see people operationalize Christianity in a way that runs contrary to what I think it is, or Britishness, or what they do with colonialism, which is a dirty word. It doesn't make sense. It's a dirty word, in my opinion. So it bugs me. So I get it, but I would like to see you respond to what I think is a legitimate argument that postmodernism has led to a lot of the things you very much decry. And I think in a way it was baked into the cake. I think part of the deconstructionist lends itself to it. Now, at the same time, I haven't studied it as much, which is one of the benefits of talking to you. So maybe it hasn't. So my goal is kind of twofold. On the one hand is to kind of outline perhaps a legitimate case as to why it's gone, where these people say it's gone with the applied postmodernism. And on the second hand is to give myself a chance to hear firsthand a more charitable, accurate description of some of the validity of postmodernism. So yeah, so that's pretty much my goal. So I would like to leave it at that for myself, give you a chance to kind of respond, and we'll just have to pick it up next time, and hopefully we're leaving all the wonderful people watching or ourselves, wanting more. But that was the basic kind of conversation I wanted to have. So why don't you respond, and then we'll pick it up there next time we have an opportunity to chat.
So, to me, the reason that these idiots at universities, to me, they're just idiots who don't know what the fuck they're talking about when it comes to anything. Is
that's pretty easy then.
If they're advocating for socialism and communism and collectivism, for one thing, that's the opposite of what postmodernists do. They criticize all of those things a lot. And maybe one way where we differ in this is if you saw people going around who proclaim themselves as Christians, and it seems like most of them, in this case, it seems like most of these people do not actually refer to themselves as postmodernists. But even if, for the sake of argument, if a bunch of people who call themselves Christians were going around and saying that Jesus is horrible and it's good that he died because he was a fucking awful person, to me, that's the exact same thing as these postmodernists talking about identity politics and all this kind of stuff, which is why I don't consider those people to be postmodernists.
Well, that's very fair. Okay, I'm genuinely gonna reflect on that and see if there is any more ground to make there. Because if you've already conceded they're idiots, that's pretty much the point.
I think we both agree that they're idiots.
Yeah, so maybe for my own personal edification, I'll throw out a couple of points the next time we speak about some of the statements that I think postmodernism empowers them to make. And the main one would just be that coherence isn't actually a valuable feature. So don't respond. I know it's probably going to create a lot of things, but I want to ask you about this because there's this idea of not needing to have logical coherence. I think it's a postmodernist idea, but I could completely be wrong about that. But this to me seems to be the key crux that they have. This idea that if it's everything's relative, you can get away with a lot of crazy stuff. And I think ultimately that's how they intellectually justify, to the extent you even need to, a lot of their malarkey. So I'll have to leave it at that because I do have to go. But I was really happy we connected the time we did, and I look forward to picking it up in the future. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, you and I can talk about this again on Saturday, like you said.
At worst, we'll pick it up there. But I do have to go. Thank you so much, Andrew. Have a great night, and we'll talk again soon, I hope.
All right. Thanks a lot, man. Thanks a lot for talking. All right. Adios, everyone.
Bye.